think we'll get started. So today we're going to talk about web performance, and I've done a lot of web performance talks before. What I wanted to try was actually doing live site reviews. So the idea is I've got kind of a standard slide deck that I could do, but what I would prefer to do is have people give me their URLs. I'm going to go to those URLs and I'm going to show performance techniques with respect to your particular site. So what things you can do to make improvements. Okay? So I'm going to have some Twitter information for how to submit that in a minute. But a little bit about myself. So I'm a full-time web developer for an e-commerce site. I've been doing it since about 1995. I'm also a Pluralsight author. Got my blog, my email, and my Twitter information. I did turn in the slides and the code for this. I've got on your, does everybody get a USB thing already? So on there should be a performance before and a performance after. So it's kind of before and after I've made these particular improvements. If you have any questions as we go, feel free to yell them out. So let's start. Excuse me. Let's start with performance rules in general. So I used to work on compilers years ago. So when I came to look at performance for my website, I was really coming at it from a what do I need to do server side in my C# code to make things faster. That's kind of the perspective I had. So I went and did some research probably 4 or 5 years ago, and it turns out that most people waiting for web pages today, about 80 or 90% of most websites, people aren't waiting for the server-side code to run. They're actually waiting for all of the page components, all the CSS, all the JavaScript, all the images, all those kind of things. So I'm not going to focus in this talk on optimizing server-side code. We're going to talk about these client-side techniques. They're all free techniques. They're easy to implement. And they can make a huge difference to your website. So the other thing I'm going to do is if I look at your website and it turns out it takes 30 seconds for your page to even run, I can't tell server-side problems from here today. In other words, I'm not going to be able to do server-side diagnostics and say that your SQL Server index is any good. But I can look from a client perspective and see how your site is behaving very easily as far as the JavaScript, CSS, images, all those kind of techniques. So the 3 rules we're going to focus on for performance. We want to make fewer HTTP requests. So today the average web page is about 1.5 meg. And like I said, I've been doing web stuff for a long time, so that kind of freaks me out. But it's about 1.5 meg, and you make about 100 requests back and forth between the browser and the server. So one of the main things we want to do is we want to cut the number of requests that have to go from the browser to the server. We also want to send as little data as possible. So the less data we send, obviously, the faster it's going to be. And we also want to send it as infrequently as possible. So those are the 3 main goals we're going to focus on with the techniques that we talked about. You can also save and make more money by having better performance. So we've seen a lot less bandwidth usage. Some of the techniques we've used have significantly reduced the amount of bandwidth we have to bring into our building, which makes a big difference for us. We need a lot less servers than we would otherwise need if we hadn't used these techniques. There's been a couple of the big companies that have decided they wanted to see the impact of performance. I couldn't get away with this, but they did. So Amazon said, we're going to intentionally make our site slower by X number of milliseconds and gauge what that does to our sales. So they can get an idea of if they did performance improvements, what would happen. I gave you a link. There's a lot of other companies that have done this, seen similar things, but what Amazon found was for every 100 milliseconds they were slower, they lost 1% in sales, which is a pretty big deal. So obviously, performance means a lot to your clients and can impact how much you're selling. Google and the other search engines are also using performance to determine ranking. So that's one of the criteria they use. If you're performing better than your competitors, you're going to get ranked higher. And I'll just talk about Fiddler here in a minute, but what I wanted to do was, that's the Twitter information I'm going to use. So if you want me to look at your URL, if you put that in, so put in webperf live. Bodie is my Twitter handle in DevWeek 2014. So if you want to do that, now while I'm showing some of the Fiddler stuff, what I hope is I'm going to come back, I'm going to pull off the first URLs I see in there, and I'm going to start using that site. I'm going to kind of then pop back and forth between slides. So I'm going to look at your particular site. I'll find something that I think you could do to make an improvement. The first time I talk about it with regard to a site, I'm probably going to pop over to the slide and explain in detail what the technique is and how you take advantage of it. And then we'll just keep doing that with other people's sites. Okay? If I don't have enough sites that people want to do, I do have my before and after site that I'll show you in regards to the site I already have created. Okay. So if you've got that, I'm going to flip over to Fiddler quick. So the primary tool that we use today is Fiddler, and what Fiddler is it's a tracing tool between your browser and your server. So I like it because it was built specifically for HTTP. It's really easy for me to see requests and responses. That's going to show me, there's a lot of clues within Fiddler doing a trace against the website that's going to show me things that you can do to improve your performance. And I gave a link to where you can get this. So I'm going to show you Fiddler in the context of my before and after site. So I'm going to start at Fiddler, and this is going to watch the conversation between the client and the server. So I've got a pretty basic web page. I've got some jQuery, so it's going to do a slideshow. It's going to cycle through some images. You can see I'm not a designer with this really beautiful header and footer. I've got some images here for Facebook, Twitter, things like that. I've got another pop-up. So I'm using a couple different jQuery plugins, jQuery core library. And if I do the after site, it's going to look exactly the same, but I've applied all the performance improvement techniques that we're going to talk about throughout this. So if we go look, one of the first things I like to do in Fiddler is you can actually start, you can highlight the pages. So these are all the pages and all the components that were requested for the before site. They have what's called a statistics tab here, so I can do a quick look and see that it was 17 requests, but you can see I've got about 1.5 meg. So that simple page was about 1.5 meg was its size. If I do a comparison to the after, we pull that up, you'll see I cut it to 11 requests, but more importantly, we got down to about 370K. So we're about a fifth the size it was before. And visually, you wouldn't notice any difference other than applying these techniques. Okay. So that's kind of the before, after, why you want to do these kind of things. So that's Fiddler. I'm going to show you some other stuff in here. We also have a timeline, but it'll make a lot more sense when I do it on an external website. So let's see if we have anybody who's brave enough to volunteer yet. Anybody want to contribute one?
Moonpig.com.
What is it?
Moonpig. M-O-O-N-P-I-G.
M-O-N-P-I-G.
M-O-O-N. Moon.
Okay.
P-I-G.
That.
That's the one, yeah.
Okay. So again, I'm going to have Fiddler running. We'll just let's get through some of its requests. All right, so most of that page is up now, so we'll go take a quick look at some of the things. So again, I want to start, I'll start right here. That's the first request. I go down and look at, and again, if we look at statistics, about 69 requests went back and forth. It's a little bit over a meg as far as the page size. So let's start looking at some of the various things that might be improvements here. So if we look at the first one of the things we can do is we can look at the inspectors. This is going to show me the raw request and response. And one of the first things I want to look for is whether or not this uses compression. So within Fiddler, if this were compressed, I would see a little gold bar right here. And I would see that it says it uses VZip compression. You can see that's a redirect. So you go to the main one right here. Okay, so the first one that was just a redirect. So it looks like it makes a request. It sees Moonpig. It wants to go to www. And then when it goes here, it actually started to use compression, which is good. The other feature I like to use in Fiddler now is what's called a timeline. So I can select all of the particular requests and look at a timeline. And this is going to give me a breakdown, like a waterfall view of this particular site and what requests were made. So let's go look through some of these. You can see how some of the stuff, which ones take longer. And we can also see, looks like those are all pretty small. You can see a couple of JavaScripts here at the bottom. So one of the things we'll talk about first is the ability to pull your JavaScript files together and do some bundling. So let me go look at particular JavaScript file, there's a couple things to notice down on the right. It hasn't been minimized. So we'll talk about, and it's not too big of a file. We're see how big these are. Okay. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start looking by size. So I can look at timeline and see things that take a certain amount of time, or I can look just based on size. So I can see we've got this particular CSS file. Sorry, it's a little hard to read because of the resolution here. No, my fiddler's not working, so give me a second. So I'm going to hone in on this one here as soon as I can get this to come on. Alright, when all else fails, we'll do that and start over. If it'll start over. So I'm just going to hit Control F5, run that request again. Okay, so this is the one I wanted to look at. So we've got a CSS file, and we can see that this one's not using compression, so we'll start talking about compression first. So let me pop over and talk about that in some of the slides. The idea with compression is that browsers and servers, and most of them do this today. I've done some testing on our site, and it's, the 98, 99% of them, of clients know how to compress their content. So if you've used Zip before, the idea is it's going to compress it on the server side before it sends it down to the client. So it greatly reduces the size of that request. So what happens is the server's going to look, if the client sends up an accepted coding, say that it understands how to do compression, then the server's going to do an on-the-fly compression. Okay. Can you tell me what's the web server you're using? Is it IIS or?
It's IIS, so yeah.
Okay. So we did this on our website. So years ago we were running out of bandwidth, and so we actually were looking for techniques. We found compression. We turned this on, and the next day we cut our bandwidth usage in half just by turning on compression for static files. We also found out that we were 25% faster. So we use a service. Have you ever heard of Keynote or Gomez before? It's a service that we use, and it's a global service, but we set it up to watch our homepage from 6 cities within the United States. So every 15 minutes, it's hitting my homepage and recording how long it takes. That's how I can measure to see improvements. So by turning on compression, I also saw that we were 25% faster. We used to pay for a product. Now, starting with IIS 6, compression is actually built into IIS and all the other major web servers. So I'm going to show you how you can set this in IIS. By default, if you're using IIS 7, static files should be compressed. So your CSS, your JavaScript should automatically be set up if you're using IIS 7. I actually turned it on for dynamic compression as well. So let me pull up IIS Manager. So if I open up my performance after site, if you look, here's compression. If I open this up, by default, if you're using IIS 7 again, static content compression should be enabled. So your JavaScript doesn't do images, but it does your JavaScript and your CSS. If you want to, you can click the dynamic. What that will do is every time I have an ASPX page that's about to go to the client, it will dynamically compress it and send it down. Okay, and we use it for all of our stuff. It's smart enough to understand that the first time it sees a CSS file, it'll actually compress it just once. It'll store that compressed content. So it's not doing it every time somebody comes back and asks for the same file. So it's smart enough to know how to do that. But by doing that kind of compression, I'll show you kind of the before and after again. if I hit my before. So that is without compression turned on. Let's look at some of the file sizes. If you look at my jQuery here, it's about 252K. If I turn compression on for my before site, again, I'll just flip it on for both of these, and I make that request again. You can see that now jQuery is down to about 97 instead of 252. So you can expect about anywhere from 60 to 80% reduction in your JavaScript, your CSS files and stuff by turning on compression. And again, if you're using IIS, it's built in, it's free. I compared it to some of the purchased products. It's just as good a compression as anything else. And we've been using it for a long time. And again, it's safe because you don't have to worry about agents that don't understand how to do compression. Don't send up the header, so then the server is smart enough to say, I'm not going to send down the compressed content. Does that make sense? Okay, go back to this again. I'm just going to re-request that so you can look at a couple other things here. The other thing I noticed is it's got a number of different JavaScript files. So I'm going to actually sort these by the content. So you can see I've got a number of JavaScript files going on here. And again, we've got the same thing. So if you turn on compression, you get that benefit for all of those. The other thing I would recommend for this is combining and minifying. So let's talk about that quick. Yes?
What is the disadvantage of it? If it's a checkbox, then there's a reason why it was turned off.
So the question is there a reason that you wouldn't use compression, essentially? So in the past, the only argument I've ever heard against the compression was it uses a small percent of your CPU. So they've done some research, and it's like 1 to 4% of your CPU will get used. My argument, if you're that close on CPU, you get other problems. And IS7 is smart enough, it actually has configurable settings. It's got a lot you can configure that doesn't show up in the UI. You can actually go on the application host config. And you can set, if your CPU for some reason got above 80%, you can tell it to not compress anymore. So really, I don't see any downsides of why you would not use compression. That makes sense. So let's talk about bundling and minification quick. So the idea with bundling, as we looked at the JavaScript and CSS, minifying is going to take out all the white space, all the comments. Depending on how aggressive the minification is, it can actually take long function names and make them a lot smaller. So the idea is it's going to make the actual JavaScript or CSS file substantially smaller than it was before. The other thing that I wanted to do when I looked at my homepage was I use jQuery. I use a lot of jQuery plugins. We've got a lot of JavaScript. We had probably 15 to 20 different JavaScript files, and we also had about 15 different CSS files that we use on our site. So by minifying and combining them, we actually saw that our homepage got almost half the time. So it's 46% faster. Again, I've used, in the way that I do it, I use Ajax Minifier. So at build time, I didn't want my developers being impacted by me doing minification and bundling. So if you build in debug mode, I actually don't do any minification. You see all the JavaScript and CSS as you would expect, so you can troubleshoot and do client-side debugging. If you build in release mode, it'll actually combine all of them. And I literally do all of mine. So all of my JavaScript files get combined into a single minified JavaScript file. I use that same thing across my entire site. So when you hit my home page, you're going to get that first download of that JavaScript file. It's minified, all the files are together, and it's going to end up being compressed. And then it's going to store it in your browser cache. And I'm going to talk a little bit about expirations. Once you get that file, if I don't change it, and you come back to my site, you never have to download it again. I said for a year, I want you to keep that file in your local browser cache. And again, it's pretty straightforward. I'll show you how to do this in IIS. So if we look, the newer way to do this, ASP.NET started shipping with bundling and minification built in. So if I want to use it, what I can specify here I can specify that I just want to get all of the JavaScript files in my JS folder, and I want to get all of the CSS files in my styles folder. And if I do that, clear this out again. You can see that I've got all of that in one single file. So rather than having the 3 or 4 separate JavaScript files I had before, it's been combined. This is the little, I don't know how well that shows up, that little gold bar is what tells me it's compressed. So I've got this compressed. And then if I look at the actual content for it, you'll see, if I can slide this over, it's been minified. So if you've seen minified files before, it takes out all the white space, all the comments, everything else. So it greatly reduces its size. And as I scroll through here, this has stuff from all of my JavaScript files again. So that's an easy way to do that in ASP.NET. And what they do for ordering is ASP.NET's smart enough to know that if I'm using the jQuery library, I need to get that first. So it knows that some of those libraries have to be the first one in that file, so the ordering is correct. What it does after that, it chooses to do it alphabetically. So it just looks in my file folder and says, here's all the files. I'm going to put them in order alphabetically. Okay? Realistically, that's not probably going to work for you. Right? It's not going to work for me. I have a specific order that I need my JavaScript and my CSS files to be in. So they're smart enough to allow me to use an API. So in this case, if I go into my global ASAX, I can set up bundles. And in here, I can specify that I want a name called My Bundled Scripts. And I can specifically order all of the JavaScript files I'm using within this in the specific order that I want them included. So it's going to minify these and put them in that order and combine them all into a single file. And I do the same thing for my CSS. Then to reference that in the front end, I just reference it using that name I created. So I can say I want my script for JavaScript to be My Bundled Scripts. And that's what's going to use that combined and minified file. Does that make sense? So if I run this again, I'll rebuild that because I changed the code behind. And visually, it should look the same. However, when I go into, you can see the name is now My Bundled Scripts. You won't be able to tell, but this happens to be my CSS styles. You won't be able to tell, but I've controlled the order. So I put them in a specific order. And that, realistically, that's what you need to do when you go into production, because you're going to have a specific order. It's not going to work out to be alphabetical. Okay, does that make sense? I'll look at one more. Let me hop back over to the site. So again, for this, the only other thing I'm going to look at is some of the image sizes. They do have inspectors, so I can see what the actual images look like. Find that. Just looking if there's any particularly large images. These don't look too bad. So I would say for this site, those are the main things I'd start with. Yeah, I'd see, I'm going to talk about explorations in a little while. We do one thing, let me see if any other ones are out here, otherwise I'll just continue with this one. Okay, so does that make sense? We'll cover those two. I'll move to another site. We'll look at some other techniques. Obviously, all these techniques will apply, so you can come back and look at a particular site and see if that makes sense for you. So maybe, there we can. Okay.
denplan.co.uk.
Den,
E-N-P-L-A-N.
like that, den plan.
That's right.
Dot.
.co.uk.
Okay, like that.
Sorry, yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Just launched yesterday and we will run it.
again, where I usually start, let's look at some of the statistics for it. Up here. See, you got about 91 requests, you're about 1.7 meg or so as far as size. So let's start looking at some particular requests. So again, we'll look at one of the JavaScript files. So I usually just start with, we'll talk about the same things quickly just to see if they make sense. So it does look like we've got compression turned on. So that's good. It looks like you've got minified files for at least some of them. So that is good. It looks like you're doing some combining as well. So you combine a number of JavaScript files, so that's good. Let's look at it. This kind of jumps out at me as far as the size. Let's see what this image looks like. Okay. So we'll talk about a little bit of image optimization for this one because that jumps out as a pretty large image as far as what you're actually displaying. That seems pretty large to me. So a lot of times I get to go to our marketing people and they have a rather large image they want to use. And I try to explain to them that we want to not have the images be that big. And they freak out a little bit, right? Because they've spent all this time getting what they think are beautiful images. And I tell them that we want to do some compression on them. They get a little nervous. So the first thing I usually cover is you got to make sure you're using the right image types. Okay, so if you're using like a logo or something that's a non-photo, you want to use a GIF or a PNG. If you're using a photo, you're going to want to use a JPEG. So I've been to a lot of particular sites that have what's really a picture and then store it as a GIF or a PNG. I do know there is some PNG image types that do some decent compression. If you're unsure, save it as both and compare. But the general rule is I can do a lot of compression of JPEGs that I can't do with other formats. So I'm going to show you how to take a particular image and how to do the compression of it. But like I said, I usually get a bad reaction that they don't want to make any changes because they feel they're losing image quality. So I end up making this little So I do this little demo for them. I take a particular image, and it might be a little hard to see here, but one of these is the original image, and then I compress it at various compression levels and tell them, show me which images are different or which image you think is the best image in this group. So obviously this one sucks, right? That's too much. That's too much. But if I look at these other ones, especially when, and that's a little fuzzy, especially when they're not stacked side by side, the likelihood that anybody can even tell the difference is extremely low. So I'll show you the one that's actually the best. This was the original. So that has 0% compression. That's how I got it. It was 172K. You can use any paint program that you want to use. I'm going to show you Paint Shop Pro is a good, relatively cheap one that I use for all my image editing. Our image people within our company use Adobe Photoshop. But this is one that just by setting the compression at 10%, I went from 172K down to 47K. So I cut it in about a third the size. And if you look at these two visually, there's not a lot of difference there. You can see a little bit darker colors here. If I decided I wanted to get a little bit closer for some reason, I can look at this one. That's still down to 31K. Okay? So let's take a look at how you do this. So again, I use Paint Shop Pro. A couple rules when you do this kind of image editing. You always want to start with your original images. So in other words, it's bad with the JPEG to save it once and then turn around and try to save it again. JPEG uses what's called a lossy compression. So every time that I'm saving it, it's throwing away some of the details. So we always keep the original image shots that we had, and we always make our modifications from those. Okay. But what I can do is I can pull up the image, and Paint Shop Pro makes this pretty straightforward. I can just say save as. Again, it's a photo, so I want it to be a JPEG. I can go into the options, and they actually have an optimizer, which will be a little hard to see here, but you can see it before and after. So I can tweak this compression level, and I can get some quick feedback in that window about how it's going to look. And obviously that's too much. So what we did is we looked at our product images. We have 400 products on our website. We didn't want to do this manually. Both Paint Shop Pro and Photoshop have the ability to run a batch. So we just took a few images. We figured out, I think ours happened to be 60% is what it was in Photoshop. So we set up a batch and said, here's our 400 images. Go run the compression for us at that level. And it compressed all the images in one shot. And we can just look at them and see if they look okay. But again, I can pick my compression level. I can actually do that save, so that's how I did that for all of these images. And as you can see, obviously from 172K down to 47K, that can make a huge reduction without a lot of effort. And again, this isn't a very expensive tool. So I would think on this one that we could probably do quite a bit better. From my standpoint, I try to keep most of the images, even for our product Photoshops, 100K or less. I can usually get them compressed to that level. Does that make sense? So we look at a couple more of these. These all kind of fall in that category of could potentially be saved. I could take this one and run it through Photoshop or Paint Shop Pro and show you. But again, I don't like to compress one that may have already been potentially compressed. So we'll look at that. The good thing, this does have expirations, so I'll talk about expirations now. The idea with expirations are, by default, so the idea with expirations is somebody comes to my website first time, right? They're going to get my homepage, they're going to get my JavaScript, my CSS, all of my images. By default, if they were to close their browser and come back tomorrow, what I always expected would happen is it's going to look in the browser cache, it's going to use those files and just show them to the user. The problem with that is that browsers aren't sure if you've modified any of these files or not. So what it actually does is it looks and it says, I have all of these images right here on the disk, but I'm not sure if they're fresh or not. So I'm going to, for each one of these, I'm going to go back to a web server and ask it, I've got it since yesterday. Have you modified this file, yes or no? So if you've ever seen 304 not modified, that kind of stuff. The bad news is all of that traffic to go back and ask the web server, have you modified this file that I already have in my cache? If your files are relatively small, it's just as expensive to go ask if they're been modified as it is to go get them. My goal on my website is I want to instead use content expiration. So I want to specifically say, I want this content to be saved in the browser for X number of days. Okay, so I'll show you how you can set that. Because if I do that correctly, if we do this on our production website, all of my combined and minified JavaScript and CSS, I say keep it for a year. And then all of my images I keep for 30 days. So if you come back and visit my site again, if I haven't modified those, it's going to pull it from your local browser cache. So why is that good? It's going to be really fast. It's not going to use any of my bandwidth. Right? It's not going to come back to my server and do anything. It's going to serve it all locally. So sometimes people get worried and say, well, that's great, but what if I do change something? If you've noticed, most of like jQuery and the other libraries have a version number in them. All you have to do is change the file name. Right? If I make any modification to that file name or the URL, that'll force it to say I don't have it in my browser cache, and I'll go back and get it. So on my homepage, I have 100 different components. If you come back and visit me, and none of them have changed, it'll pull it all locally, and you're done. You made one request to my server, and it's going to be extremely fast. Okay? If I did modify, I'll change one of those names, and then it'll look and say I don't find that in my cache. It'll come back just for that file to my server. So the idea is I get the best of both, right? I'm going to get it fast, local, not hit my server, not use my bandwidth, and compression or the expirations are pretty easy to set. Let's see how to set them. So again, in this case, we're going to IIS, we're going to the performance after. We'll go look at the client folder. So this is where I have some of my minified files. I can set, it's in a really weird place. It's under HTTP response headers. If you open this, there's a set common headers. And then you'll see this expire web comment. So all I do is I break out on purpose. I put all my JavaScript in the folder, all my CSS in the folder, all my images in different folders. The the reason I structure my website that way is it allows me to set different expirations. So images, I feel we might be changing often enough that I just do the 30 days. But for my combined files, I set it to 365 days. So when I go back, what I notice then is inside of Fiddler, you can see this caching column. And I can see that you've already got content expiration on these. So if I come back, browsers are getting slightly smarter about looking at, if you don't set these, they use some heuristics to decide, should I go ask for it or not. I just want to set it manually like you have and what I would do to ensure that I'm the one controlling the browsers in the back of the editor. So that's a good thing to keep that both set. So, look at a few of these. I guess the other one here, so you've got quite a few different image files. And again, after I move past the size on those, the next thing I would probably recommend for this is using a CDN. So I'll talk about a CDN and what that would do. So what a CDN is it's a global network of servers. So for me, I've got my CDN has a set of web servers within the United States. I'll push my images so that they get pulled from a CDN. I'll show you how you can do that. But the idea is by doing this now, when a user comes to my website, they hit my home page, they'll see when all my image links refer to a CDN. What will happen is the browser will go talk to the CDN and find out the closest server to themselves. So when you hit it, it's going to go out and locate and say, this CDN server is closer to you. So it's going to try to serve all of my image files from that server instead of coming all the way back to my original web server. Okay? If that CDN server doesn't have the files, it'll come back to my website, get all the image files, download them, and then anybody else who hits it will get it from that CDN. Okay? So again, we did this originally because I'm in a small town in Minnesota. Getting bandwidth to come in is expensive, so we wanted to reduce primarily our dependence on getting more bandwidth. So we pushed all of our images up to a CDN, which cut a lot of our bandwidth usage. Since then, we've also started putting my combined CSS and JavaScript files. I also pushed those up to a CDN. So now, the only thing that you'll actually hit my web server for when you come to visit is my actual ASP.NET page. That's the one that has to hit my database and do all that kind of work. The rest of all the images and everything will get served by a server that's much closer to you than my actual web server will be. The good news is when we did this years ago, there weren't that many providers, so it was pretty expensive. These days, there are a ton of CDN providers, so there's lots of options for who you want to use. I'll show you what it would look like in code. So first I'll show you an example with respect to jQuery. So if you use jQuery, you know that you can actually download the jQuery core library from a number of CDNs, from Google, from Microsoft, actually from jQuery.com. So I've listed up here the various ways that you can download it. So here you'll notice, instead of specifying my JavaScript file coming from me, I'm pointing it at Microsoft CDN. So now what will happen is, when I make this request, it's going to find the closest CDN server that Microsoft has, and it's going to serve that jQuery file from there. Okay. The other good thing is if I've already been to another website that also uses the same CDN, it's probably already in my browser cache. I don't have to download it at all. That's the other advantage. So if we make this request, you can see it ran my ready function. I'll give you a little hint. A week after I moved my combined JavaScript and CSS out to a CDN, the CDN had a failure. And so I had blank pages and stuff. So I learned how to do fallbacks that day. So here's the fallback technique. You can actually specify, if you put in this line of code, if window.jQuery is not defined, in other words, it couldn't get the download from that CDN, I actually rewrite it, hold that locally on my own web server. So again, I'm getting the best of both. It usually uses the CDN, but if the CDN fails for some reason, I can turn around, and I do this for both my JavaScript and CSS. There's no good way to tell if the CSS is there, so I use the same technique. If I assume jQuery failed, I assume the CDN isn't working. I'll rewrite and pull my combined files from my web server so that you don't fail as a client. It's going to be slightly slower, but you'll still get all the stuff that you need from that CDN. Does that make sense? So as I said, when I actually code, what most CDNs do today, they let you use a subdomain. So I'm making up an example here since I'm a Pluralsight author. I'm saying if I had my stuff hosted on pluralsight.com, so www.pluralsight.com, the CDN will typically give you a subdomain name, so like content.pluralsight.com. This is now when the browser sees this, it tries to resolve that name, and it's actually, while it does the DNS resolution, is where it picks the closest CDN server. So I'm going to get back the IP address of the closest CDN server, and that's where all my images are. Does that make sense? So all I have to change is every reference that would have been a local reference within my website, all I need to do is prefix it with this, and now it becomes something that gets pulled from my CDN. Okay. I will mention, I don't actually do any of this. I don't actually pull my jQuery file from the CDN because I already have one CDN and I've already combined all of my files into one. I really don't want to point to get one single file from another CDN. So I don't actually do that for jQuery. I bundle my jQuery core library in my one JavaScript file and host that out in my CDN. So that would be the next thing I would recommend here, because you're pulling a lot of media content. Putting all that content and hosting it on a CDN could greatly reduce the time the average client needs to get that down. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you combine everything in one file, and then when this is the first write, that's when you get it. And that's great fast in browsing the site, but isn't the first hit the one that you want to be fast? Because that's their entry.
Yeah, so the question is, do you, I made this choice. You don't have to combine. So for instance, if you looked and said, part of my website over here uses a bunch of JavaScript that my homepage doesn't, for instance, you could actually create two separate bundles. For us on our website, most of these things we use all over, and in fact, the homepage is where we've got the most plugins, because we got slideshows and everything. We decided once it was minified and compressed, it's so small. I mean, it's smaller than, I think our compress for ours is probably in the 150K range. People have images bigger than that. It's worth that one hit. And because I do the expirations like that, you'll never have to ask for it again. So we're willing to take that hit on that first page with us. But you can do different bundles. I forgot to warn you about one other thing. Thank you, Microsoft. I combined all my CSS files, worked great. A few months later, somebody came and said, these styles aren't getting applied like they're supposed to. So I was in developer tools trying to figure out why it wasn't working. And it turns out that IE has a limit of 4,096 unique CSS rules per style sheet. And I crossed that number. And IE just starts ignoring me after that. So I only found it because I started chunking up my CSS files. So on my production site, I actually have two separate combined and minified CSS files. Because the one I did happened to cross over that limit. So just be aware that's still out there. So if you're going to do combining only of CSS, just be aware if your CSS files are rather large. You might have to do more than one combined file, if that makes sense. So we just selectively said these 15 are, if I show you back here, these 15 will go into, I just created another bundle. So, here's the first 10 of them. I know they'll fall under the 4096, put them in my bundled styles. The other one is my bundled styles too, and I put in the other CSS files. So that's just something we had to manage. Thank you, Mike. Okay, so that's CDNs. We talked about the image optimization. I didn't see anything jump out at me for, as I plugged through here, that they're the wrong image types. As far as it looks like most of the photos are JPEGs and stuff, so I don't think there's a concern there. And that's where I'm going to go right now. So the question was for Sprites. So what you can do is you can do combining. So we talked about you want to reduce the number of requests you make. So we looked at our home page. I got all the JavaScript down to one file. I got all the CSS down to 2 files. So what I had left was a bunch of images on my home page. So the next thing I wanted to find was what's the right technique to use to reduce the number of requests you get for images. And I'm going to talk about this one first, CSS Sprites. Let's see if this will work. Why does it do that? Click, current slide. There you go. All right, so the idea with Sprites is I looked across our homepage. I don't want to do this for big images, but there's often a lot of small images we use for borders and navigation and things like the Facebook or the Twitter, small icons. Rather than serve each one of those separately, you can actually take all those images, shove them into one image, and they call that a CSS Sprite. And then it uses CSS to index into that image and pull out the image you want to display. So I'll show you what it looks like first. So let me go back to the close images. So if I look at the before and the after again, you'll notice I've got this Facebook, Twitter, and email down at the bottom. In the original site, you can see that each one of those is an individual image. So what I wanted to do instead is I wanted to combine those and put them into a single image. And that's what I did with this sprite. So you can see now all three of those exist in one physical image. So I listed on here, there's lots of ways to create sprites. I've used this website before. What you can do with this website is take all the images you want to put in a sprite, stick them into a zip file, go to that website, and it will make a sprite for you. And not only does it make the sprite, it also kicks back all the CSS you need to make it work. So if I look at what I had to change, so before these used to be images. I had an image link for Facebook, Twitter, and email. Now instead I'm using a span and I'm using this class Sprite Facebook. So it just took the name of whatever my image was, prepended Sprite dash, and then it gave me the CSS I need to make that work. So if I go into here, the website gave me these. And if you see what they are, is they all refer to that same image, but they use different positioning. So they use an offset into that image to pull out the right one. So visually now, there's different ways that I could have referenced it. I chose to use a span in this case. But doing that with that style, visually it's going to look like it's an image again. But I've cut out, instead of 3 requests, I only now have 1 request. So I did this on my home page as well, and I think we cut about 20% of the time by taking out half of the images. So again, you don't want to do it on big images. So on our site, I wouldn't do it for instance, I wouldn't do it on these, the big ones, but these little ones like that, it makes a lot of sense if you put them into a sprite file like that. The other way to do that is using image maps. So image maps, here's another website. If they happen to be right next to each other in the display, you can also use an image map. And so I don't think I have an example. You can see if I made one of those. I did. The idea of the image map is, again, I put them all into one image, but the image map then points to the right place. So one of the advantages of this is if I go run it, as I hover, you probably can't tell, but at the bottom left of my browser, it's giving me some indication of where that's going to go. An image map does that, and because these happen to be right next to each other on the screen, it can show that one image, and then it carves it up so it knows where it's going to go. So either one of those 2 techniques work. I find that in production, the sprites are more useful, because I literally took half, I looked at my homepage, and half of them were good candidates for sprites. So I made up 1 single sprite of that. And if you ever use Fiddler and trace most major websites, you'll see an image like that that's full of a whole bunch of small icons and stuff. That's Sprite. And again, it's a technique just to reduce the number of requests that go back and forth. So any other question on Sprites? So that's another good technique to use. So let me switch over to, let's do another site quick if anybody has. Anybody have another one you want me to look at? Otherwise I can flip over So one of them, we talked about the proper image types, PNGs. Another one is multiple domains. So the other thing we looked at is we wanted to view our solution. Okay, so we use a CDN. So I used the example I gave you, content.pluralsight.com, right? That's where I reference all my images. The way browsers talk to servers, originally they were supposed to be allowed, they'd come and get your home page, and in the specification it said you can open 2 additional back connections to that web server to get images and CSS and JavaScript, so it doesn't have to do one file at a time. Browser vendors started figuring out if they made that number bigger than 2, they would look faster, right? Because they're basically concurrently getting more of your components at the same time. So the idea with multiple domains is, let's just say 3. If a given browser opens 3 connections to each domain, if I were to use content.pluralsight.com, content1.pluralsight.com, and content2.pluralsight.com, I'm going to get 9 things going at once, right? So I'm going to get concurrently, maybe 9 images will be downloading in parallel, which will make my page speed up. So again, the idea is you make a new DNS name. You don't have to use a CDN to do this, but I would do it in context of a CDN. So I did this, I did some testing. I used 3 domains, and I split my images across those 3 domains, and then I did a bunch of testing to see how much faster it was. It was about 20% faster. That's great. So I said, well, I might want to do this. Then I started thinking a little bit about what that meant to me as a developer. So let me go show you what I have to do in code. So I've got 3 images here. I'm going to reference one using content1, content1, and one content2. By doing that, again, I have a lot more images than that on a real site. It's going to open up back connections. To each one of these, I'll get 3 or however many the browser allows. So it's going to make it faster. The trade-off is each domain name that I use, my browser now has to go do a DNS resolution. So they've done a lot of testing with various sites, and they say the sweet spot seems to be about 3 domains. That's what I chose to test. You use a lot more domains than that. It ends up spending time doing the DNS resolution, so it's not worth it. You can play with your own stuff and play with numbers. So I started doing this, and then I started thinking about what is this going to mean for my web developers? Well, if they make a mistake, and I put that in the slides, you need to ensure that however you reference an image file, you do it that way consistently. Okay? And I'll show you why that'll matter. Let's say I'm pulling this flag right now from content.pluralsight.com. Let's say on another page you use that same image, but you use content1.pluralsight.com. Well, guess what? I set up all those expirations and everything so I can keep this image in the browser cache. If you reference it with the wrong domain name, you just circumvented all the expiration work I did and forced it to go all the way back to the web server. So I deemed this, for me, trying to carve up my production website into 3 different domain names and making sure all of my developers followed all the same rules. It wasn't working for me. I actually thought more often people might not do that correctly and would actually penalize me. So I haven't done this yet. I know people that do it. You have an easy way to carve up your images. So you say maybe all of your product images come from here, all of your logos and stuff come from here, and you believe people will follow those rules consistently, then multiple domain names might make sense for you. It is 20% faster, so I've got it kind of in my toolkit to know this is something I can do if I really need it. Because right now I don't think it's worth the effort for us. Another thing we did on one of our pages was lazy loading images. Okay, so what we did is we had a category page on our website. So we sell food, so we have an ice cream category. We had maybe 150 products in there. The way the website used to work, we used paging. So I'd show you 15 of them, you hit page number 2, that kind of experience. Our designer came back and said, I really don't want them to use paging anymore. I'd like it to be one big long page. And I said, well, that's fine, but that's going to kind of suck for performance, right? People are going to download 150 images, most of them will never see because they're way down on the page. So I went on and I found a lets me actually do lazy loading images. So what it does is, whatever I feel is going to show up on the first screen for most people, just use a normal image tag and everything's great. Every one that I think is going to be below the fold, I'm going to change it. Instead of having a source that points to the image, I'm going to have that source point to a 1x1 clear pixel image, really small. And then I'm going to put a data dash original attribute that points to the real image. And then this jQuery plugin is smart enough to know that as I scroll down, it knows when these images are about to cross the fold and be visible. So it will actually flip. It will take the data original, shove it into source, and then your browser will go download those images. And what I've seen in production, it keeps up pretty well. I mean, it's hard on our site. I can probably do it from here because it's in the US. But as you scroll down, it does a pretty good job of seeing I'm about to come in. The download occurs before the person notices. So if they just start downloading and scrolling the page, most people will never know that I'm using this technique at all. Occasionally you'll see a blank space where the image should be, and then the image will appear as you go down. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here I've got, I'll show you what the page looks like. In Fiddler, you can actually make it act like it's a modem, God forbid. So we'll do that just to show you what this looks like. So these two images are just normal image tags, but as I scroll, okay, it's locally off my machine, so even that can look more than it's too fast. These other two, I specified as the source should point to a clear image. So this is a real small, I just made a 1x1 invisible pixel image. All of the ones that are below the fold will reference that image. But if you look, the real source to the image is in this data dash original. If you've seen data dash attributes before, it's part of HTML5. Browsers ignore those. But my client-side JavaScript, that plugin says, as soon as I am about to come into view, go pull that image down. So it does that in the background for me. Again, I've got a link here to where you can get that down at the bottom. So it's a free jQuery plugin. And all I need to do is I mark those images as lazy load image. And then in my ready function, I tell it I want to lazy load all of those. And then there's some tweaks I can do on this about how sensitive I want it to be, like how far away from the fold. So if I have particularly large images, I can be more aggressive and get them in the background. But so there's those kind of tweaks that you can do. Does that make sense? And we'll show another one. Sometimes the speed stuff has not as much to do with actual performance as perceived performance. So years ago when we used to work on a lot of sites and people had modems, we used what was called progressive JPEGs. And what they were was, it's easier to show. Watch how this guy renders. See that top one, how it was fuzzy? You see how this bottom one is coming in line by line? The top one is a progressive JPEG. So what it does is it gets you a fuzzy version of the complete image first, and then slowly brings the quality up, versus the JPEG where it's doing that line by line. So if you happen to have images on a page, or you happen to have clients that are really slow, this can be a big perceived performance improvement. Again, when you're just visually looking, you'll see that image looks like it's already all there on top. And again, you can save that in PaintShop Pro again as a tool that supports it, but when you go on and say save as, progressive JPEG is one of the choices. So if you want to, you can look into using that if that fits for your situation, because the perceived performance will be a lot better, even though the download probably takes about the same amount of time. Okay. And that's becoming a little more popular again because with mobile clients, 3G and some of that, it's just, it works out that progressive JPEGs are useful again. We'll talk about one other thing that I keep forgetting and keep learning over and over. My URLs are case sensitive. Okay? So if I have an image, you notice how I have this flag image. There's one single image in my image folder. So if I open this up, I've got this flag bridge small right here. However, when you reference those things, the case matters. So if you look at this example, I'm going to turn the modem stuff off. the screen in Fiddler. If I make a request for this page, all three of these are the same exact image, but because I reference them with a different case, you'll see the browser actually had to download all three. And so the bad news is if you don't have a standard for how people are referencing your images, your CSS, your JavaScript files, if they do anything different in the case, all the stuff we talked about for explorations and stuff goes out the window. I mean, they'll end up re-downloading the file all over again. And obviously someone's not going to do this, right? You're not going to do it 3 times in a row and do it wrong. But across my entire website, do I believe somebody references my logo the wrong way? Probably, and that's likely. I've got a Pearl site course I did on log parser, and I actually have a, how many people have heard of log parser before? It's a Microsoft, okay, it's a Microsoft utility that lets you write queries against your web server logs and other stuff. So what I did is I wrote a program that uses the log parser assembly. It actually looks through my web server logs and looks for requests that have different cases. So I can actually run this against my production log files and see where do I have files or URLs that are actually the same but differ by case, so that I can go track down who's not referencing stuff the way that they want to reference. If that makes sense. So that's one way you can track down this. Otherwise, you just got to have pretty good standards about, am I going to do camel casing, how am I going to reference these things, so I don't end up having this problem, because it effectively is making you download images that you don't have to download. Okay. One thing that's helpful when you do some testing, so in order to do testing and simulate, sometimes I wanted to see what would happen, for instance, if my JavaScript file took a long time to download, just to see what that does for how things get rendered, so I can decide where I want to put in performance improvements. I created what's called a delay module. So let me pull this guy up. If you've seen HTTP modules before, a module is just something I can use to intercept all the requests that go to my website. So I wrote a module that just says, if I see a query string of delay request, I want you to intentionally slow that request down so I can see what kind of impact that would have on my performance. So I can come in my web config here, I can turn that module on. If I go run a particular page now, see, this is going to start spinning, and once it shows the URL, it's got a 10-second request delay on it. So what you could do, see that delay request, I can tack that onto anything, a JavaScript file, a CSS, an image. So I'll use this to selectively see, for instance, if my JavaScript or CSS is slow, what does that do to the rendering experience for the client? Does that make sense? So it's easy to use. You could turn that on, show your boss that the site's slow, and then you can tell them on Monday you worked all weekend. Get that off. So, anyways, so that's kind of handy. If you need to do some specific performance testing and see what the impact is on an individual request, there's not a good way to do that other than setting up a module like that. Another thing that is worth doing is setting up fallbacks using HTML and CSS. So I want to start using a CSS3 technique like opacity. Okay, that's something built in to do transparency for my images. So a technique I might want to use from a performance standpoint is it's going to perform better to use something that's built into the browser than do it the old way, which is using jQuery. So jQuery has a cross-browser way to do this opacity. So what I can do is I can set up, how many people have used Modernizer before? I think I saw one of your guys' sites has Modernizer. Modernizer is a free JavaScript library that will run some code on the client and see what the client supports for HTML and CSS3. So what I can do is I can say, well, here would be the scenario. My designer comes and says, I really want to have this be transparent like that. Okay? And I can say, well, that's great. That's built into CSS3. Can I please just do it? I'll show you what site I use. If you've been out to Can I Use before, you can type in a feature like opacity, and it will tell me by browser who supports it. So I can come in here and say, look, everybody in the world but IE8 supports opacity. Okay? IE8 is like 5% of my customers. You know, if they didn't see a transparent image, are any young kids gonna die? Probably not. So I try to convince him, let me code it like this, because that's simple, and I do not. Usually that doesn't work. He says, no, it has to work that way. So my choice would be I could go back and use jQuery. The bad thing is I'm using jQuery just to get that opacity. That has a performance impact, right? I have to get the core library. So what I can do instead is I can use this fallback approach. I can use Modernizer. If I include Modernizer, it can do detection and tell me whether opacity is supported. So it's got this conditional mode. So it'll test and say, does your browser support opacity? I like that. Nope, it doesn't. Okay. Then go get the jQuery core library, because I know that that will work. So from a performance standpoint, if we were to trace this, there it is. I'll trace it first. So we use IE, and we'll notice, refresh it again. Okay, so I had to get the actual, I'm going to sort it by frame. I got the HTML, I got Modernizer, and I got the image. Right? So on a browser that supports opacity, that's the best I'm going to do from a performance standpoint. If I put this in fallback or compatibility mode and go back, you'll notice that now it had to go get the jQuery core library. So it's just from a performance standpoint, if you can use HTML and CSS3, things that are built into your browser, it's going to perform better. You can have less to download. But using Modernizer with a fallback technique like that lets me still work across all of the various browsers, but only need to do the additional harder work or additional downloads. Often I'll actually have to pull in multiple files. I'll have to get other jQuery plugins, not just the core library. So I can take that performance impact only on the people that have the older browsers, but still give everybody the same support. Does that make sense? That's kind of a decent performance approach. Another one that I'm looking at now, we have a lot of third-party tags for marketing. So if it were just me, you'd come to our homepage the first time, you'd get my combined files, all my images, stored on disk, close your browser. You would go back. Your browser should make one request back to get my ASP.NET page. If nothing else has changed, you're done, right? I'm not that lucky. Marketing makes me put in those third-party tags for tracking and all the other stuff I have to do. Those are things I don't control. The third-party things that I can't set or set expirations on, things like that. But one thing I can take advantage of is the new async and defer attributes on JavaScript. So I haven't done this yet in production. We're just starting to do this, but a lot of the time that return visitors spend on our website, because I've got everything else cached, is waiting for all these third-party tags. What I can do is, instead of saying script and point at a JavaScript file, I can actually say script async. And what async will do is it'll tell the browser, this isn't something you need to do your initial rendering. Just go get it in the background. So it'll get the first page displayed. Because if you know what happens with JavaScript by default, every time you hit a JavaScript link in your HTML, I talked about parallel downloads before, those all stop. Browsers are just written to say, when I hit a JavaScript link, I'm going to go download this thing, and nothing else is going to happen until that download is done. So that's why you hear sometimes people say, put all of your JavaScript links at the bottom of your file. I don't know if you've heard that recommendation before. That's why. You want all of your CSS and everything else to be done. I've personally tried that. I tried to move jQuery and all my combined stuff to the bottom, and it doesn't work. So on our production site, we have some dependencies where that just doesn't work for us. If it works for you, great. But what I can do with all these third-party ones that aren't required for the actual page to display, I want to investigate using either async or defer. And what will happen then is my page will complete, the browser will stop spinning, the user thinks they're done, and in the background it's going to get these third-party tags as downloads in the background, so it's not impacting my performance. So that's an area that we're looking at using right now. The browser support for async is just getting better. The goofy thing with async is that the order is not controlled. So the source order that I have my JavaScript in, if I put async on it, whatever order those things are done downloading, it's going to go and execute it. If For these third-party things, I don't care. I mean, they're not dependent on each other, so it doesn't matter. If you happen to have a dependency on defer, is not supported by as many browsers, but defer actually runs them in the order. So it'll get them all in the background, but it won't start running them until it gets the first one done. Then it'll run in order, so your order is guaranteed. Does that make sense? That's something I'm looking forward to on our site in production, just to, because we have a lot of those tags, and that will allow me to not have to make the user wait for those.
What kind of browsers? The older browsers.
The older browsers?
Fall back to sync.
Yeah, they'll just fall back to sync. So if they have the async on it and they don't understand it, then your worst is going to be as bad as it is today. So, see if we got any other ones on here. So I finally got all of my stuff to be the way that I wanted it on my homepage, except for one annoying request that happened every time. And that was the fave icon. So every time your browser comes, it tries to pull that fave icon. So I've gotten rid of all my other requests but that one. So I looked around and I finally figured out how to get rid of that one. You can actually reference a specific favorite icon by using a link like this. So what I did is I referenced my fave icon from my images folder. Because my images folder has expirations, you won't come back and keep asking for the fave icon every time you visit my website. So this is one more request I got rid of. So I literally got down to one. Because by default, if you don't you don't normally specify this, right? You just draw a faveicon.ico in your home directory. Every time a browser comes to your site, it'll come and ask for your favorite icon. It's just another request it does all the time. It annoyed me that return visitors had to come and get it again. So by specifically specifying it and putting it in that folder with expirations, you don't come back and get it the second time. And again, if I have to change it for some reason, I can change the name, and then you start pulling it again, even if it was in your browser cache. Okay. So it's just one more way to cut an annoying request out. Any other questions on anything so far, or any other just kind of performance, or anybody have another site that you want me to go through? Those are most of the techniques. I can start talking about some of the other server-side techniques that we use, or if you have any specific questions, we can go through those as well.
Yes, do you recommend image encoding base 64?
Okay, so yes, so encoding images in base 64, the data URIs. So what they do is, you can actually take an image and you can base 64 encode it, and you can embed it directly into your HTML. So that's what this demo is. I took a particular image, I'll just show you what the page looks like. So I have this XML image. If I do this, I base 64 encode it, and I get this long string. And then with browsers that support it, I can now reference right where I had the image source. I can actually reference and say this is a GIF, it's base 64 encoded, here it is. That does cut the number of requests, so it is a way to reduce the number of HTTP requests. The bad news from my standpoint is, I'm a normal e-commerce site, so I have to support all sorts of different browsers. This started with IE8, I still have to support IE7. So I would have to have dual techniques, one for IE7, one for not. The other bad thing is base 64 encoding makes your file size grow by about 33%. And so that's the other trade-off. And I've seen people talk about data URIs in particular around mobile. They said they don't perform very well on mobile devices. I don't know why. So for those three reasons, I personally have not used them. But it is possible to do this. So to me, it's one of those, if it makes sense, try it out on your site. If it improves your performance and you have the kind of client support that you want, it's a technique that people use. I just personally haven't used it yet. But under in the code example, that's where you find it. So you just have to take that image and base 64 encode it and then embed it. Yes?
Sorry, Rob. You use databases on your websites to go back to.
Yes.
Do you ever use data caching on like a
Okay.
data set?
Yep, so now we'll venture out of the client stuff and talk about, so he was asking about data caching. So on our website, so we were an ASP site years ago. We were an early adopter for .NET 1.0. So when I got .NET, I said this cache object is really cool. I should use this. So we, our backend, we call web services that access our database. So we never talk to the database, but we get it from a web service layer. And so we were toying with, if we cached just our product data and our category data for one day, we wanted to see what that would do. So we set it up, it was easy to do. I mean, I call the web service. When I get the data back from the web service, I put it in cache. You have to worry about some locking. You know, you don't want race conditions and stuff to populate, and we talk about that. But just by doing that caching, we watch SQL Server the next day. Just those two things, just from my website, cut 50% of all of our SQL Server queries. Would freak me out. I mean, all the other systems that use that SQL Server, we were causing half of the load on SQL Server because of those two pieces of data. So we use caching a lot. I mean, we'll look at, so what we chose to do is we said that product and category we'll keep until 3 a.m. that night. And then, so somebody changes a product name during the day or a description, it won't get reflected. At 3 a.m. we drop our app domains, which forces it then to go. So we have a reset. If you've done an IS7, you can tell it reset your app domain at a specific time. So we just chose to automatically every night drop our app domain, which throws away all your session and all your cache. So then the next victim that comes to the website is the one who has to sit and wait to go get the product and category data. And then it populates it until the next 3 a.m. And so the only real trade-off is we do have a lot of discussions with business people that are kind of freaked out that their stuff is cached. You know, not, you've called it unbreaded chicken for 5 years, but now you need to change it within an hour. You can wait till 3. So it's worth the trade-off.
But you're pulling that information out though with the web services, and I'm thinking of I'm working on something that putting information in via like a form,
Okay.
and it caches it for a certain time, and then I run a store procedure then to push it towards the database.
Yeah, so you can do that as well. I mean, just the effect of having a cache, so my front end doesn't have to go all the way back through the web service, all the way to the database, makes a huge improvement. And in ASP.NET, that cache object, I don't know if I have an example of that. I'm not sure if I do. So, in this data caching, oh, I even have locking. Awesome. Okay, so what happens, you have to write this correctly if you have a lot of load. Because what will happen is, when that 3 a.m. cache gets dropped, you might have 5 people on. God forbid, 3 a.m. ordering food, I don't know why they're doing that. But if they all come at the same instant, they might all try to go make the same request to the web service. So we wrap it in this get data function. And this guy uses locking. So the first thing you do is you say, is the cache empty? You know, for whatever reason, the data's not there. You can use in C#, there's a lock. This lock will ensure that only one person will move forward. So if you've done mutexes and stuff, this lock statements, I have a class down here specifically just to do the lock on. And then I do the erase for cache. And the first thing you have to do when you get in there is make sure that it's still null. Because what will happen, let's say you and I both make a request. I come, I get the lock, it's null, I get the lock, I make a call, you're stuck on the lock. As soon as I free that lock, you're going to come in next. I don't want you to make the request again. So right when you get the lock, you come in and say, is the cache still null? Or did somebody that beat me in the lock fill it? And then that way you only get one request each night. But if you look at this example, it'll go through how to do that. And then this insert, you can pick either, we do sometimes top of the hour caching. So when they don't like to do it once a day, we'll say we'll cache it till the top of the next hour. And so that's what this technique is. So it's, as it's changed in the database, it'll drop at the top of the hour. Somebody will see it's not there. They'll win the lock. They'll go get the data. We'll put it in cache up until the next hour again. But it makes it huge. Not only does it make it, a SQL Server helps scalability, it helps reliability, all for that whole day. My product database can be down, and I don't care. And this is each web server. So at my production farm, each of them has their own copy, right? When I use this cache, I don't have a distributed cache solution, because each one of them has a bit in their own memory. But the reliability is a lot better, it's a lot faster. When you come to one of my product pages, I'm pulling it out of memory on the web server, not going all the way to the database. So it's a huge win for us. So we do a lot of that. Okay. Any other specific questions on that?
Yeah. If, for example, you have a product details page, and then you wanted to use that sort of caching, but you've got people in the office who are using a content management system, and they might say they notice the price is wrong, and it's actually, it's down as 5 pence, not 5 pence. It's a significant problem you can solve weekly, but it's not going to change at 3 AM, but it can't wait.
Yep.
There's a way that it can validate.
So the question is there a way to invalidate the cache? We actually create a page, and so we've got a page that we can hit. That page, you can go in and say, I want to specifically drop that cache entry. So all I have to do is write a page that clears that cache, and that is fine. So if we did have an emergency, we could hit that page, put in our authentication to say, it's one of us that's doing this, we know what we're doing. I want to drop that cache entry, but we don't know that. There's nothing built into, for us, nothing built into ASP.NET that would do that. But we pre-assume some of these things we might have to drop, so we have pages that let us do it. Otherwise, we've got a web farm too, we've got some of our servers in, some of them out. We would get it right on these because they didn't have a cache yet, and we'd flip those in and take the other ones out. That'd be the other way we could deal with it. So. Any other specific questions? Okay, if not, if you notice, DevWeek does have an app. I would appreciate it if you could do the evals, so you know how the session went. I said I'm a Pluralsight author. I've got trial cards up here if you want a free month. They're also out in the exhibit area if you don't get one here. I've got a course on web performance. I talked about the log parsing stuff. I'll sit around and wait if anybody has specific questions after this. And otherwise I have a talk at, I think, 2 on mobile websites if you're